Venezuela's ousted president, Nicolas Maduro, has made his first appearance in a U.S. federal court, where he pleaded not guilty to narco-trafficking charges. Maduro declared himself a prisoner of war and insisted he was still Venezuela's leader. He and his wife were seized in a U.S. military raid early on Saturday in Caracas. If convicted, the pair could face life sentences.
It's been a long day for Nicolas Maduro. The former Venezuelan leader and his wife, Celia Flores, were taken from jail and helicoptered to court in Manhattan. There, they were officially charged with narco-terrorism and other related crimes. Both pleaded not guilty, with Maduro saying he was still the president of his country. And then, shortly after, he was taken back to prison. His next court appearance is set for March. Meanwhile, across town, the United Nations Security Council met for an emergency session on Maduro's capture.
Good morning, everybody.
The US was widely criticized for its actions, which most say violated international law. Much of the criticism was coated in the language of diplomacy, though Russia's ambassador was less restrained.
The assault against the leader of Venezuela, compounded by the deaths of dozens of Venezuelan and Cuban citizens, in the eyes of many, has become a harbinger of a turn back to the era of lawlessness and U.S. domination by force and chaos, which continues to afflict dozens of states in various regions of the world.
Back in Venezuela, Maduro's replacement was sworn in as the country's new president. His former deputy, Delcy Rodriguez, now has a daunting task ahead of her. She's already made some more conciliatory signals towards Washington, but whether or not that will be enough is largely down to Donald Trump.
Let's bring in Gloria Browne-Marshall now. She's a constitutional lawyer and associate professor at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. She joins us now from New York City. Thank you very much for being on the program.
Thank you.
So, Gloria, from an American point of view, can a leader of a foreign country who was forcibly detained outside of the United States be tried in a U.S. courtroom?
Yes. To answer your question, it's not just that it's a leader of another country. You could take a foreign national and, under a subpoena, have that foreign national tried in a U.S. courtroom. In this particular case, because it's the president of another country, it's not just an average individual, but the law remains the same, that an individual from another country, and we've had that happen in other instances as well, one of them being Noriega and other leaders who have been taken by U.S. by force and tried in U.S. courts, and actually had these trials go to full verdict and have them found guilty and serve time in U.S. prisons.
Now, as you were saying there, this action is legal by U.S. law, but at the same time, some have criticized the U.S. action as illegal under international law. So the question is American law and international law at conflict in this situation?
Very often, domestic law is in conflict with many parts of international law. And in this particular instance, people have said, well, why isn't this person being tried in an international criminal court? But the United States is not a member of the International Criminal Court. The countries who are members, had to sign on and have their nations agree to be tried under that court, and therefore be one who could bring that law to bear against another country. Since the United States is not a member of the International Criminal Court, then if it is in fact in conflict with international law, then it's up to other bodies within the United Nations to push back against the United States. And that's happening right now.
All right, now let's focus on Maduro's lawyers and his defense. Now, his defense team are expected to contest the legality of his arrest, saying Maduro is immune from prosecution as a foreign head of state. Do you think they have a point?
If a person is not immune under U.S. law just because they are a head of another state. president, prime minister, whatever that title may be. That does not make them immune to prosecution based on U.S. law. But once again, U.S. law can be in conflict with international law or policies under the United Nations. But when you start looking at the actual charges against him, you begin to see that these are somewhat antiquated. Possession of machine guns, for example, or even with the very general phrase narco-terrorism. How is that being defined? Is he supposed to be the leader of an organized narcotics ring, an international narcotics ring? Now, we know under international law that would be a violation, but under U.S. law, how are we proving that he is the head of this narco-terrorist ring? So when you start to look at the charges against him, then you have to see under U.S. court that a person is innocent until they're proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Not beyond all doubt, but beyond a reasonable doubt. So these charges within the indictment have to be proven in a court of law. And then, of course, we get into the very sticky territory of, can he receive a fair trial in the United States? That will be one of his arguments.
So it sounds like there are a lot of legal avenues for his defense team to pursue. What more can you tell us about the legal team that will be defending the Venezuelan leader?
Well, Barry Pollock is the leader of the legal team at this point. He has worked on many high-profile international cases. But here's one of the concerns. When Donald Trump first gained presidency for the second term, he did something that was unprecedented, along with many other things he did that were unprecedented, probably and unpresidential, in that he had these major law firms, international law firms, actually come to him and sign agreements that they would be under his control, that they would give him and people he desired to have free legal attention their all. They would actually donate law hours and members of the legal team. Why is this important? That means that when he went through and got the signatures of the major law firms signed on to his side, that means there's going to be a void of those people here who have the qualifications and have the financial background and resources in order to defend the people that this Trump presidency is now going against. That puts us in a very difficult situation because the United States is a litigious country and there are many lawyers, many law firms, but these are very keen, narrow issues of law that require a type of background that not every lawyer has. And so we're going to be at a deficit in many ways because the lawyers with this international law background are some of the very lawyers that are now part of the legal teams, or at least under contract with the Trump presidency.
Those are truly some concerning developments. I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. That was Gloria Browne-Marshall, a constitutional lawyer from New York City. Many thanks for your analysis.
Thank you.
Let's bring in Leslie Vinjamuri. She is the president and CEO of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. She works on international affairs and U.S. global engagement. Leslie, to what extent do you believe Washington is trying to send a message to the world as much as it's sending one to Venezuela? And why does that matter?
Well, first of all, I think the number one message that the U.S. is sending is most definitely to Venezuela. We've seen this build up for some time, even for those of us, including myself, who were very surprised when we woke up to the news that Maduro had been captured. If you walk this back, that those signals had been sent by the fact that boats were being captured, that there was a military buildup in the region. So I do think that the number one signal is to Venezuela. Clearly, President Trump has a wider agenda in the Western Hemisphere and for the rest of the world. And I know that in Europe, we're all worried about Denmark. There is a very clear signal being sent: spend more, be strong, be tough, and be aligned with this U.S. president and his administration if you wish to preserve your sovereignty. It's a very, very unsettling message for many people. But I think the number one focus right now is on the Western Hemisphere and on Venezuela.
As you well know, over the years, there's been a lot of discussion on both sides of the political aisle in the United States about Washington avoiding endless wars. From the vantage point of your public opinion work, does this operation align with or cut against where Americans say they want U.S. power to be used in the world?
We are running polling in the week ahead. I think that I anticipate that people will be very concerned. But, I think we have to be very clear about what's happening here. A, nobody's entirely sure what the next steps are. B, we've seen a leader removed, but we have not seen a regime change. We've heard words articulated by the U.S. president in that first press conference that America would be running the country. That will send shivers and terror down the backbone of many Americans who fear U.S. occupation, the expenses, the personal cost associated with it. But that is not what we're seeing. What we're seeing right now is language threatening the current regime with complying with U.S. wishes. But we have basically injected the United States tremendous uncertainty into Venezuela. But it has so far, the facts so far, it's been a very limited, targeted, from a military standpoint, highly effectively executed operation. But clearly the rest of the world and many Americans will be deeply concerned that this is going to lead to something more serious, more long-term. I personally doubt that will be the case. We're not seeing that kind of mobilization being prepared for an actual occupation or takeover of Venezuela.
About half a minute or so, but I do want to ask you, how likely is it that we're witnessing, let's call it a Maduro doctrine moment, where Washington normalizes using military force plus the courts as tools of regime policy?
It's terrifying. It sort of subverts the rules that the United States is, for the most part, frequently with abrogations, but for the most part tried to uphold, at least in theory. Now there's no attempt to uphold those rules. I do think, however, it's important to note, no matter how appalling, how shocking, how contrary to international law, we are not talking about the U.S. president removing a democratically, legitimately elected leader. We're talking about him removing somebody who the international community has abhorred for a decade, for a very long time.
We hear you. Leslie Vinjamuri, many thanks.
I'm now joined by Rebecca Bill Chavez. She's the president and the CEO of the Inter-American Dialogue Group and served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Western Hemisphere Affairs in the Obama administration. Rebecca, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So far, President Trump has not ruled out more military action against Venezuela. Is that something you are legitimately concerned about?
It is. I mean, he labeled it, I think he called it in his press conference, a potential second wave. And he has said subsequently that if Delcy Rodriguez, who has now been sworn in as president, that if she does not sort of comply with U.S. demands, that would be the next step. So yes, I do think it's a possibility. I don't think it's what anyone wants, however.
Now, Venezuela's acting president, Delcy Rodriguez, as you mentioned there, is offering to work with the U.S. after the Trump threatened that she could pay, or the Trump administration rather, threatened that she could pay a very big price. But the question is, how willing are members of the government likely to be to participate in work with the U.S.?
That's an excellent question. And one thing to keep in mind is Delcy Rodriguez has been part of the illegitimate regime, the very repressive regime. She served as Hugo Chavez's chief of staff. She's a hardliner. She has been there when we've seen these massive human rights violations, these crimes against humanity. So she's there's been talk about Madurism, I guess would be the translation without Maduro. But she's there. The two other figures that are still there that are worrisome. One is Diosdado Cabello, who's the Minister of the Interior, who is in charge. Today, I think we've seen these colectivos, these kind of armed groups of thugs, I would call them, going into the streets after this emergency decree, saying that if you are in favor of U.S. intervention, that you will be subject to this sort of really brutal repression. And then we also have the former minister the current minister of defense is still there, Padrino Lopez. So there are in both Diosdado Cabello and Vladimir Padrino are in the U.S. indictment.
Now, you were mentioning some of the alleged crimes that the Maduro government is alleged to have committed. So if there is a successful transition of power and living conditions in Venezuela improve, to play devil's advocate, would you say that the military strikes were then justified?
First of all, it would be a long time before living conditions improve. I mean, Venezuela, the idea of even providing stability in Venezuela is going to be incredibly difficult, given, I mean, in a sense, it could be more difficult now without Maduro there. There are so many competing armed groups in Venezuela that are going to kind of take advantage potentially of this power vacuum and that have vested interests in maintaining this kind of lawlessness that they've really capitalized on over the past decades. So as far as living conditions improving in Venezuela, I don't think we're going to see that anytime soon. And the other question is democracy, right? We haven't heard about a long-term plan to reestablish democracy in Venezuela, and to, you know, the timeline to have elections or to restore. I mean, the 2024 election, we all know, was stolen by Maduro. The legitimate winner, of course, was Edmundo Gonzalez with Maria Corina Machado as his running mate. And we haven't heard about a timeline that would restore democracy in Venezuela, which I think is also concerning. And it is also a prerequisite to improving the living conditions of Venezuela, of Venezuelans.
So a very complicated situation on the ground in Venezuela.
Very.
Let's zoom out a bit, if we could, for just a second. Trump has also threatened Mexico, Colombia, Cuba, and even NATO ally Denmark over Greenland. So are we about to see the power dynamic in the entire region change after this attack on Venezuela?
Well, I think it's consistent with a new national security strategy. However, boots on the ground in Venezuela would not be consistent, because that would suggest sort of another forever war. But this idea of the Trump corollary to, you know, and research, like revisiting the Monroe Doctrine, I mean, all of that would be consistent with this. But it is, I think it's very worrisome. I think Mexico in particular has been a long time partner of the United States, and any sort of intervention, military intervention in Mexico would be very much against U.S. national interests. In Colombia, they're going to have an election next year. So in the case of Colombia, I don't see anything happening in the near term. But it is all very worrisome.
Yes, these are very concerning times. That was Rebecca Bill Chavez, President and CEO of the Inter-American Dialogue Group. Thank you very much for your expertise.
Thank you.
And Venezuela's Delcy Rodriguez, who served as vice president to Nicolas Maduro, has been formally sworn in as interim president. Other senior figures in Maduro's government appear to have held on to their roles, but it's not known for how long. Here's a closer look at who is still running the country.
A long-time member of Venezuela's ruling party, Delcy Rodriguez had been vice president since 2018 and now becomes the first woman to lead the Latin American country. The daughter of a leftist guerrilla fighter, she held other important roles in Venezuela, including foreign minister. Along with Rodriguez's job as vice president, she was also simultaneously finance and oil minister, a key position in the petroleum-dependent economy. Rodriguez made many contacts in the US oil industry and Wall Street. She's believed to have dealt directly with US President Trump's special envoy, Richard Grenell. However, she has remained under sanctions by the US, EU and others for supporting and overseeing the crackdown on dissent in Venezuela. But unlike Nicolas Maduro, Delcy Rodriguez is not wanted on criminal charges in the United States. Her brother Jorge, seen here on the right, is another senior member of Maduro's regime. He is also not wanted by the US. He's the president of Venezuela's National Assembly and is widely regarded to have been the chief strategist in Maduro's government. Jorge Rodriguez has also been a lead negotiator in talks between Caracas and the US. Another powerful member of the Venezuelan regime has been Defense Minister Vladimir Padrino López. He has been a loyal figure to Nicolas Maduro. Padrino López has served as the head of the Venezuelan armed forces since 2014 and is wanted by the US for alleged international drug trafficking. Diosdado Cabello is Venezuela's powerful interior minister and is also wanted by US authorities for alleged narco-terrorism. He has direct control over the country's police forces and intelligence services. Cabello has held many senior roles in government, including vice president. He has a brother, José David, who is also part of the Maduro inner circle.
I can now welcome Sandra Weiss to the program. She's a journalist who's been based in Venezuela for many years. She joins us now from Mexico. Thank you for being on the program.
Thank you, Aaron.
So Delcy Rodriguez has been sworn in as interim leader, but her government is still marked by Maduro loyalists. So do we know if they're ready to work with the United States?
It depends on, if you have a look at Delcy Rodriguez, she has been known as an ideological hardliner, but she had also good contacts to the US and business leaders and figures out of the opposition. So she has been quite useful for the regime to negotiate, but she's contested with inside the Chavismo, and just the situation in Caracas is very tense. And just some minutes ago, people in Caracas filmed barricades and armed civilians in the streets. Gunfire was reported near the presidential palace, and it's still unclear what is going on. But there are speculations that it could be a fight between two opposing factions of Chavismo.
And of course, we've seen pro-Maduro protests in recent days, but also a crackdown on dissent with orders to arrest anyone who supported the United States attack. So what more do we know at this hour?
Well, those demonstrations were organized by the regime. The government usually uses employees, obliges them to go to these protests. But that's for the show, that's for the TV cameras, and it says nothing about the situation on the ground. People in Caracas, I've been talking to some of my old friends, and there's fear because the regime has mobilized the colectivos, which are the armed paramilitary groups, and they are patrolling the streets, intimidating people, and they have been arresting journalists throughout the day.
And what's also probably ramping up the tension are threats from President Trump that the U.S. could carry out further strikes on Venezuela and maybe even put boots on the ground there. So how is that being seen by everyday Venezuelans?
Well, for many Venezuelans, the first attacks came as a shock, and the trauma still runs deep. A colleague told me that he felt humiliated and never wants to experience that again. We mustn't forget that there were also civilian casualties. I think Venezuelans will forgive Trump for the first attack because he took Maduro away, and Maduro is finally facing justice. It served to get rid of Maduro, but it would be a different story with a second strike, and then the mood could really change.
Now, Trump has also threatened neighboring Mexico. What's the reaction been to his comments so far?
In Mexico, the reactions of the government has been very harsh. They told Trump that he has to respect sovereignty and international law. And he has hinted that Mexico could be the next one, Mexico or maybe Colombia. So the situation is also very tense here, and it's really a challenge for President Sheinbaum to deal with Trump in the White House, because they have also upcoming negotiations about a free trade treaty with Trump. So there are many subjects on the table, and it's really hard to deal with everything.
All right. That was journalist Sandra Weiss. Thank you very much for your reporting.